Hi, I'm Peter Miller, and I'm Dean of the Bard Graduate Center. And I'm here with Paul Stirton on the somewhat bittersweet occasion of his retirement and looking at both back and forwards. So, the first question I want to ask Paul is you've been at the BGC for about 10 years, but you had also visited beforehand as a visiting professor. So I'm wondering if you could say something about how the BGC is different now from the way it was when you first had encountered it.
Well, that, as you rightly point out, Peter, I first came to the BGC in 1999, so actually over 20 years ago, which seems rather remarkable, at least in my memory. And the intellectual character, I think, of the BGC was very often set by some of the more prominent figures who directed the general intellectual climate, if you like. When I first arrived back in 1999 with my then colleague from Glasgow University, Juliet Kinchin, I think we were both struck by, well, to begin with, there was a rather unusual range of different intellectual approaches. One of the leading figures at that stage was Derek Ostergaard, who very much belonged to an old school connoisseurial tradition. He's incredibly knowledgeable, but his approaches were very subjective and quite opinionated. And I think he left not long after that. And when I came back in 2002, then in 2008, I think the dominant figures intellectually were probably Ken Ames, who very much came from an American material culture background, and Pat Kirkham, who came from a British design history background. And they gave a lot of the teaching and the general discourse on design, material culture, a certain identity. And I think it's not just because I'm speaking to you at this stage, but the fact is that when I came back in 2008, I think your presence was much more noticeable, bringing greater concern for the history of ideas, for historiography, and bringing in areas of social and intellectual history to what had previously been perhaps something more disparate, focused on the object. Now, I think over my 12 years of being a professor and being a full-time member of the faculty, I think I've been aware that the BGC has a really momentous role to play in the study of decorative arts, design history, and material culture. And there is still a lot to do. I think certain colleges and centres have been sort of nodes of innovative thinking in these areas. And I think probably places like Winterthur in the 1980s and 90s, the Royal College of Art in London was a very innovative centre in the 1990s. But I think these colleges have, if they've not fallen away, they're no longer the intellectual leaders. They're not driving the debate on the history of design and material culture. And I think the BGC has an opportunity to pioneer new ways of thinking about, particularly about objects in history. So it's not material culture studies or design history or anthropology or whatever, just finding new ways of interpreting objects, making them submit to intellectual and historical analysis. And I think in a way, it's not just about filling in the gaps, but finding new techniques of analysis and interpretation. So we're doing quite a lot of interdisciplinary teaching at the moment, and which I really applaud. But I think we're going to have to take this a bit further and use these interdisciplinary methods as a way of freeing up rather rigid ways of thinking into more transferable skills between the disciplines. So I think we're still at a fairly opportune moment where we can take advantage of what I think is potentially a vacuum. Because although historians are looking at objects and material culture now, they'll move on. But material culture and designed objects are the main focus of our whole intellectual project. And I think that's how we've evolved, but I think we've still got more to do. If that doesn't sound rather both ominous and also rather celebratory, I hope.
No, I like the way I see it neither as ominous nor celebratory so much as, in a way, programmatic. And that's a good thing to leave us with to think about. Let me ask a second question. What are the three sort of highlights of your time as a faculty member at the BGC?
Oh, that's quite easy because there's many things that I've taken from being on the BGC faculty, but a few things do stand out for me, and they might be, for people who know me, they're probably rather predictable in that sense. The first is obviously launching the journal West 86. That was a daunting but also incredibly exciting time back in 2009, 2010. We had so much to do. Although the BGC had an earlier journal, Studies in the Decorative Arts, we had to start from scratch. There was nothing that we could use from that other than the intellectual climate that would allow us to create a new journal. We had to, first of all, negotiate a new contract with the University of Chicago Press. We had to decide on the format, articles, reviews, translated texts, exhibition reviews. We had to work out a design, a system of printing, production, how to acquire the content, as well as how to assess the content, our own peer review system. Now, much of this was helped when Dan Lee came on board. Dan's a master at the whole system of publishing, preparing things from words on a page to an actual journal. He made it so much easier. But I remember that period now as one of partly worry, but also immense elation when things fell into place. And over the years, well, West 86, I'm still feeling very proud of it. Hopefully I'm not too self-important about this, but I do feel that it's done well in its decade of existence. So that's definitely the first. And I do look back on the various crises and moments of great excitement and success with quite a lot of fondness, albeit tinged with a couple of sleepless nights. But it was all really well worth it. I think the second thing that I would want to point to is that what the BGC allowed me to do was to teach my research interests. And some of my research interests are fairly abstruse, not least my interest in Hungarian design and craft. And one of the most rewarding features about teaching this in the BGC was that where I thought this might be a minority interest, it proved to be very appealing to the students. So my courses on what I called Other Europes, which are really very much about Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, to a lesser extent Poland and Yugoslavia, and very much in the period of the late 19th and early 20th century, were often oversubscribed. So being able to teach something I was fascinated by and was actively researching and writing on was really heartening, and it kind of gives you a lot more confidence about what you're doing when you discover you're not just speaking to a tiny group of people with a shared interest. But this subject has a potential to appeal to a vast range of people. Well, a vast range, at least the BGC students. And that struck me as being very, as I say, rewarding and enjoyable. Now, the last thing, which is really fairly obvious, was the book and exhibition, Jan Chickold and the New Typography. That was ultimately, I think, the most rewarding experience of my whole time at the BGC. And as I always do have, I have a copy of the book beside me. It's always here. Well, first of all, discovering or being told about the Jan Chickold collection in the architecture and design department in MoMA, which Juliet Kinshin did for me. But seeing then that this material, which had been used in the Museum of Modern Art, but never really displayed in its own terms, this would make a great exhibition, and just the kind of research-driven exhibition that the BGC encourages in the Focus project. So developing that project with the gallery staff, especially Marianne LaMonica, and I'd known Marianne for a long time because I had previously been a fellow at the Wolfsonian when she was a curator there. But it was very good to work with her, and indeed to develop the exhibition from what was really several hundred small bits of paper and turning this into what ultimately proved to be, I think, a very appealing, interesting, and I thought very engaging. And it was very important that Mariana helped me, as did all the other gallery staff, in bringing about an exhibition that ended up looking more or less how it had first appeared in my mind. That rarely happens. And that also goes for the book itself, because researching and writing the book was an enjoyable but challenging experience. But then seeing that realized, and I have to say, in Jocelyn Lau's design of the book, which was more than I could have expected, and the fact that Dan Lee brought it from my text and the images that we had from MoMA to something that I'm still very pleased with. Every time I look at that book, I have a kind of warm feeling. As anyone who has published will know, you're usually disappointed or frustrated with one or another aspect of the process of moving from research to writing to publication. And I can honestly, I've written 7 books, 3 with other authors, but I can honestly say that this is the book that gives me most personal pleasure and pride. Don't want to sound too self-important about that. But as I say, when I look at it, I'm pleased with what's inside it, and I'm pleased with how it looks. And I really think it's something I'm going to still get a lot of pleasure looking back on. If that is 3 things, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. And I'm sure I could name another half dozen, but these 3 are the ones that stand out for me.
Thanks. And final question. What are the intellectual projects you're now looking forward to tackling as you'll be a little freer going forward?
Well, I'm continuing to edit West 86 for a while, and funnily enough, today, as we were speaking, I was just editing an exhibition review for the next issue of West 86. So I will carry on doing that for a while, which I'm pleased to be doing because it does draw me into areas of research, scholarship, whole fields of material culture that I know very little about, but quite quickly learn a lot from. But The intellectual projects that are personal, I would say some of them grow out of the book and exhibition Jan Chichold and the new typography. There are a number of individual designers that I began researching, particularly the Germans, people like Johannes Moltzahn, Max Burchardt, who are not household names, not compared to people like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy or Herbert Bayer and many others. But they're very interesting designers, and I would like to do a bit more with them. In doing research for the book, I had a fellowship at the Getty in Malibu, and I came across some new material in relation to Kurt Schwitters, the Dadaist, who was also an important graphic designer and a close correspondent with Jan Chichold. I would like to work that up into something. I don't know yet. As you know, when you're working towards a book or an exhibition, there are deadlines. Certain lines of thinking have to be just cut off because the exhibition has to go on the wall. So I thought I would be returning some of these. But while I was writing that book, I was living in the house of a Yugoslavian textile designer called Bernat Klein, who moved to Britain after the Second World War and was very successful, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, an important figure in British, what might be described as British mid-century modern design. And that's a subject that I knew very little about in the past, but I'm planning to do a bit more work on him and the architect that he collaborated with, a man called Peter Womersley. Womersley's not well known outside Scotland. Bernat Klein is known throughout Europe and increasingly so in America. So I think that will be a personal project, a labour of love that won't have any end point, but I'll hopefully just carry on working on these figures for as long as I'm able.
Paul, labor of love is a wonderful term, and I think it captures a lot of how we at the BGC experienced your time there as a faculty member, and I think it's a beautiful way to tie up this interview. So I want to thank you very much, and we've been talking here today with Paul Stirton, professor at the Bard Graduate Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.